He rode 1,500 miles on horseback, slept in the rain for 3 straight months, risked his life every single day against snakes, stampeding cattle, and bandits, and when he finally reached the end of the journey, he owed money to the boss. This isn't fiction. It was 1876, and it was completely legal. The cowboy you know from the movies never existed. The truth is, much worse, and no one ever told you. Fact 1. A cowboy's base pay would last 3 days in New York. Let's put things in perspective. In 1880, a cowboy made between $25 and $40 a month. Sounds fair? Well, a factory worker in New York was taking home around $50 to $60 during the same period. That worker put in 10 hours a day, slept in his own bed, and didn't have to worry about getting trampled by a bull. Now the cowboy? That guy spent 16 to 18 hours in the saddle, slept on the hard ground, and was responsible for herds worth 100 times more than his pay. If he took those $30 and went to spend them in New York, the money would be gone in 3 days. Adjusted to today's values, those $30 would be about $900 a month. Breaking it down by actual hours worked, the cowboy was making something like 6 cents an hour. The federal minimum wage today is $7.25 an hour. The guy was literally risking his life for next to nothing. Fact 2. A lot of cowboys didn't even realize it, but the money they earned went straight back into the boss's pocket. Big ranches kept their own in-house stores, known as company stores, where the hands bought everything: food, boots, tobacco, rope, ammo. The problem was that prices could be up to 3 times higher than in a regular town. A pair of boots that cost $3.50 in town would go for $8 at the ranch store. And to make it worse, a lot of ranchers paid their men in ranch scrip, a kind of voucher that only worked there. In other words, the cowboy worked the whole month and ended up with not a single real cent in his pocket. It was a no-way-out cycle. And here's the detail most people don't know. This system was only outlawed in 1938, when the Fair Labor Standards Act finally put an end to the practice. That was nearly 80 years of legal exploitation, out in the open, with nobody doing anything about it. Fact 3. The cattle drive season. 4 months for $120. Let's do some simple math. A cattle drive from Texas to Kansas lasted 3 to 5 months. The cowboy made about $30 a month. Sounds reasonable, right? Except nobody ever saw that full amount. Before leaving, a lot of them already asked the boss for an advance, anywhere from $15 to $40. On the trail, food was deducted from their pay, around $8 to $15. Lost a rope? Broke a saddle? The rancher charged them for that too, anywhere from $10 to $30. The result, after months of dealing with storms, stampedes, and flooded rivers, the guy got to Kansas with less than $40 in his pocket. In today's money, that's about $1,200. 4 months of risking his life for that. For comparison, Jeff Bezos makes the equivalent of $4,000 a second. A cowboy in '86 needed a whole season to earn what a billionaire makes before you can even blink. If you're enjoying these wild facts about the real Old West, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next, because it only gets crazier from here. Fact 4. Here's a detail not many people stop to think about. The cowboy spent the whole day on horseback, but that horse wasn't his. A good working horse cost between $50 and $150 in the 1870s, something like $3,000 today. With a salary of $25 to $40 a month, the guy would need months to save that kind of money, and that's assuming he didn't eat, drink, or buy a new pair of boots. In reality, almost no regular cowboy actually owned the horse he rode. The animal belonged to the ranch owner, and that created a trap nobody talks about. Without his own horse, the cowboy couldn't just leave. There was no way to cross those distances on foot. If the boss cut his pay or made conditions worse, the hand had no real choice. He was stuck there, dependent on another man's horse just to get around. And the rancher knew it and used that advantage without having to say a word. Fact 5. You think free lunch at work is a good thing? Cowboys found out the hard way that it wasn't. The chuck wagon was the rolling kitchen on long cattle drives. Ranch owners sold it as a perk. We feed you on the trail. It sounded generous, but nobody ate for free. Every meal was deducted straight from their pay, and the amount charged was almost double the actual cost of the ingredients. The ranch spent about 30 cents a day to feed each cowboy, but deducted between 50 and 80 cents. And the menu? Watery beans, low-grade salted meat, and hard biscuits that could break your teeth. In other words, the cowboy was paying restaurant prices for food that barely kept him going. That trick of offering a benefit that actually costs the worker more never went away. To this day, companies still deduct required uniforms and cafeteria meals straight from people's paychecks, charging more than they're worth. Fact 6. Here's something not many people know. Ranch records from Texas and Kansas in the 1870s and 1880s show that as many as a third of all cowboys were black or Mexican. They rode the same wild horses, faced the same storms, and drove the same cattle for months on the trail. But when it came time to get paid, the story changed. A white cowboy made between $30 and $40 a month. A black cowboy doing the exact same job made between $20 and $28. That meant about $10 less every month, the equivalent of roughly $300 today. And the worst part, there was no law to appeal to. Now compare that to 2023, when black workers in the U.S. still earn an average of 76 cents for every dollar a white worker makes in the same role. The number in 1880 was similar, just without any legal protection at all. Fact 7. A rancher with 10,000 head of cattle sold each one for $25 to $40 in Chicago. A single sale could bring in as much as $400,000, something like $12 million in today's money. Now here's the part that hurts. The total cost of all the cowboys on an entire cattle drive was around $3,000. That's right. In one shot, the owner made more profit than the whole crew together would earn in 10 years of work. These men spent months dealing with rivers, storms, and stampedes to deliver the goods that made another man rich. The biggest ranches in Texas in the 19th century were worth the equivalent of today's Fortune 500 companies. And the cowboys who built all of that with their own hands. Most of them died without a cent in their pockets. The math never worked out for the people doing the hard labor. Fact 8. A cowboy broke his leg falling off a horse, and you know what happened? Nothing. Nobody paid for a doctor. Nobody covered the days he couldn't work, and nobody guaranteed he'd still have a job when he healed. Bull goring, snake bites, accidental gunshots. All of that was routine, and the risk was 100% on the cowboy. A doctor in the 1880s charged between $2 and $5 per visit, which could mean up to 5 full days of a cowboy's wages. A lot of them would rather treat their injuries themselves with whiskey and dirty rags, which often ended in serious infection or death. The boss had absolutely no legal obligation to help. If the guy couldn't ride, he was replaced the next day. The first workers' compensation system in the U.S. didn't show up until 1902 in Maryland. Until then, every injured cowboy was simply on his own. Fact 9. The cowboy's retirement. It didn't exist. You complain about your 401k? The cowboy had nothing, zero, no pension, no social security, no savings. When his body couldn't take it anymore, when that happened early, he was simply left with no income. By age 50, if he even made it that far, A cowboy was dealing with severe arthritis, a wrecked spine, and hearing damage from decades around cattle. A lot of them ended up in workhouses or living off charity. Social Security didn't come along until 1935, more than half a century after the peak of the cattle trails. Until then, growing old poor was pretty much guaranteed for anyone who lived in the saddle. And here's the part that stings. Today, around 40% of Americans still don't have enough savings to retire. In the 19th century, among cowboys, that number was basically 100%. The difference is that today, at least there's some kind of safety net. For them, there was absolutely nothing. Fact 10. Nat Love was known as Deadwood Dick and was one of the most respected cowboys in the Old West. He won roping and shooting competitions that drew huge crowds. His name appeared in newspapers from coast to coast, but when the era of the big ranches came to an end, nobody came knocking with a decent offer. In 1907, he published his autobiography, Out of His Own Pocket. The book sold reasonably well, but as printing costs swallowed almost all the profit. No publishing deal, no guaranteed royalties, no lawyer. He was left with the crumbs from his own story. He died in 1921 in Los Angeles, working as a hotel porter. A man who had once been a living legend ended up opening doors for guests. And here's what hasn't changed. Independent musicians and writers today still fall into the same trap. They create the work, get the fame, and somebody else gets the money. Fact 11, let's do some simple math. A cowboy on the Texas to Kansas Trail made about $30 a month. The trip lasted around 4 months, so he took home about $120 total. Now here's the part that hurts. Each head of cattle sold for $35 to $45 in the Chicago markets. A single steer was worth more than the monthly pay of the guy who spent weeks risking his life to get that animal there. And each cowboy was responsible for 300 to 500 head. Do the math. 500 cattle at $40 each came to $20,000 in sales. The cowboy who made that possible took home $120. That's less than 1% of the value he helped create. The ranch owners knew exactly how much each animal was worth. The cowboy knew it too, but he had no bargaining power at all. It was take it or leave it, and everybody took it because there was no better option in the West. Fact 12. Whiskey and brothels. The end of trail economy. Months on the trail, eating dust, sleeping on the ground, and risking his life. And the pay? Somewhere between $40 and $80. Now here's the part that hurts. When the herd reached Dodge City or Abilene, the saloon owners were already waiting. Literally. They knew the day the cowboys would show up and doubled the price of whiskey on the spot. One night of drinking, gambling, and brothels cost between $15 and $25, more than 30% of the pay from months of work. In 48 to 72 hours, the cowboy was broke all over again. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a system built to squeeze every cent out of him before he had time to think straight. Today, they call that a debt trap. Back then, it was just Tuesday in Dodge City. The cowboy worked for the ranch, but the people getting rich were the saloon owners. Fact 13. Here's something not many people know. Back in the cattle drive era, there was no signed contract between the cowboy and the rancher. The deal was verbal, sealed with a handshake. Sounds fair, right? But in practice, the rancher held all the power. After weeks or months of hard work, he could simply refuse to pay. He'd come up with any excuse, bad behavior, disobedience, whatever he felt like claiming. And the cowboy had no way to prove anything. No signed paper, no formal witness, no recourse. Historians estimate that up to 30% of cowboys went through this at least once in their lives. They worked through sun, rain, and the risk of death, and in the end, walked away with nothing. And here's what ties it to the present. In 2023, the U.S. Department of Labor documented more than $3 billion in stolen wages. Looks like some things never really change. Fact 14. The Great Drought of 1886, when the Cowboys paid the price. The winter of 1886-87 became known as the Great Die-Up. Temperatures of 40 degrees has swept through Montana, Wyoming, and Texas, killing between 60 and 90% of the cattle in some regions. It was a catastrophe. But look at who really got screwed. The Cowboys. The big ranch owners lost cattle, but they had land, banks, and political connections to get back on their feet. The Cowboys, meanwhile, lost everything overnight. Their jobs, housing, and food. No notice, not a cent in compensation. Tens of thousands were left out on the street in the middle of the worst winter the West had ever seen. There was no unemployment insurance, no safety net at all. Capital reinvented itself. The worker was left to fend for himself. And that pattern, where the rich protect themselves and the working man absorbs the loss, played out the exact same way in 1929, 2008, and 2020. Fact 15. Lasso, ranch, rodeo, Mustang. All of those are Mexican words. Did you know that? Mexican vaqueros had already mastered cattle, handling centuries before the American cowboy even existed. They were the ones who taught Americans roping, horse breaking, and herd driving techniques, and their reward, lower pay for doing the same job, often better. After 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised to protect the land of Mexicans who became American citizens. In practice, court cases handled entirely in English stripped property away from families who didn't even understand what was being decided. They lost land, cattle, and dignity through the law itself. Even the word buckaroo comes from vaquero. Americans took the name, the technique, and the knowledge. They just forgot to give credit. The vaqueros trained an entire generation of cowboys and ended up working as hired hands on the very same land that had once been theirs. Fact 16. Cowboys made next to nothing. We're talking about around $25 to $40 a month in the late 1800s. In today's money, that's somewhere between $700 and $1,200 a month. Working 16 hours a day under blazing sun, rain, the risk of stampedes and attacks. Meanwhile, the ranch owners, many of them investors from New York or London, who had never ridden a horse in their lives, were making fortunes. The XIT Ranch in Texas covered 3 million acres, backed by British capital. The Cowboys running that whole operation had no claim to land, cattle, or a share of the profits. They were basically disposable labor. And when the cattle drive was over, fired without a second thought. No retirement, no insurance, no nothing. The guy doing the hardest work got the scraps. The guy in a suit in Chicago got the gold. Fact 17. $30 a month. That's what a cowboy was taking home in 1880. Now look at this. A worker in a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, was making $32 during the same period. $2 more. But that worker slept under a solid roof every night, didn't deal with storms, snakes, or stampedes, and clocked out at the end of the shift. The cowboy worked from sunrise to sunset, 7 days a week, risking his life every single day, and still made less. Adjusted to today's money, both were making something around $900 a month. So why would anyone choose to be a cowboy? Because they sold the idea of freedom as if it were payment. Instead of paying more, ranchers offered an identity. The guy wasn't a badly underpaid worker. He was a free man in the West. That trick of trading pride for fair pay didn't die in the 19th century. Silicon Valley does the same thing today, swapping pizza and ping pong tables for unpaid overtime. Fact 18. A wheat farmer in Kansas in 1880 with 160 acres could make between $400 and $600 a year. It doesn't sound like much, but it was more than a cowboy made during the same period. And the farmer slept in his own bed every night. The cowboy spent months in the saddle, dealing with storms, stampedes, and bandits, only to come back with less money in his pocket. The difference was that the farmer faced other risks: drought, pests, and loneliness in the middle of nowhere. Those $500 in 1880 would be worth about $15,000 today. Neither one was getting rich. And it was exactly that frustration that gave rise to the populist movement in the 1890s. Farmers realized they were breaking their backs while speculators and railroad owners were getting rich off them. The 1892 populist platform was already calling for a minimum wage, a progressive income tax, and control of monopolies. Ideas that seemed radical at the time but were all passed decades later. Fact 19. The end of the cattle drive. Who killed the cowboy? In the 1870s, driving cattle from Texas to Kansas meant months on the trail, dealing with rivers, storms, and bandits. A cowboy made about $1 a day doing that brutal work, but his real enemy didn't carry a revolver. It ran on steel rails. When the railroad spread across Texas between 1880 and 1885, those 1,500-mile journeys became a thing of the past. What used to take months now took days by train, and it cost nearly half as much per head of cattle. Tens of thousands of cowboys lost their livelihood in less than a decade. There was no government program, no retraining, no nothing. They just disappeared from the economy. Sound familiar? The same thing happened to textile workers, farm laborers, and assembly line workers in the decades that followed. Automation isn't a 21st century invention. It started by killing off America's most iconic profession. Fact 20. Most Americans picture the cowboy as a free man, in control of his own destiny, riding across endless land. That image wasn't born on the prairies. It was born in publishing offices in New York. Starting in the 1860s, the so-called dime novels flooded the country with stories about Western heroes who never lost, never owed anybody anything, and never went hungry. The problem is that the authors of those stories had never even set foot in the West. Meanwhile, the real cowboy was making about $1 a day and had to work 4 hours just to buy one of those 10-cent books that romanticized the very hard life he was living. Fiction has always sold better than reality, and that mechanism never went away. Today, content about financial freedom and entrepreneurship is consumed mostly by people who work hard and still can barely pay their bills at the end of the month.